The river stretched before them, a long, silent serpent, its surface darkened by the heavy monsoon clouds. This was a Hydaspes, a river that had sculpted the very land long before kingdoms rose and kings etched their names in stone. Now, in the summer of 326 BCE, its relentless currents would determine the fate of two legendary figures, Alexander of Macedon and King Porus of Parava. But before a single spear could be raised, the river itself became the first adversary, testing the mettle of every soldier who stood upon its banks. Alexander observed it from a low ridge, the wind whipping at his cloak, while distant thunder echoed across the plains. The monsoon had arrived early that year, the clouds heavy and low, pressing down on the earth as if attempting to smother it. Each day, the river swelled with greater force, as if it too resisted the advance of a foreign army that had marched across continents. Yet Alexander's gaze remained steady, tracing the contours of the riverbanks, assessing the unseen depths. Strategy was already taking shape in his mind, quiet and patient, mirroring the river's own steady rhythm. Behind him, the Macedonian camp pulsed with restless energy. Horses stamped in the mud, and soldiers huddled beneath makeshift shelters, honing their spears and whispering about the enemy they had yet to see. Tales of Porus had spread like wildfire, a giant of man, as brave as a lion, commanding war elephants so immense that even veterans of Issus and Gaugamela felt a prickle of unease. The sounds of the jungle only fueled their imaginations, the deep rumbling of unseen beasts and the piercing cries of nocturnal birds slicing through the darkness. Alexander moved among them without escort, his mere presence causing soldiers to straighten their backs. He rarely spoke at length. A simple nod, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet word of encouragement. These were enough to remind the men that they stood beside a leader who had never led them to defeat. Yet even he felt the weight of this land. India was unlike Persia or Egypt. It breathed differently. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and the scent of unfamiliar flowers. The earth felt alive, filled with voices the Macedonians couldn't decipher. Across the river, Porus also kept watch. He had positioned his army along the opposite bank, not to provoke battle, but to deter it, to stand as a living testament to the fact that this land would not yield easily. His elephants formed a line behind him, their silhouettes looming like hills against a flickering torchlight. Their trunks swayed in slow, deliberate arcs, as if sensing the tension in the air. The Indians did not fear the approaching storm. They had lived under such skies their entire lives. What they feared was the relentless will of the man who had vanquished kings across the known world. Porus was not young, nor was he a man inclined to retreat. His people called him Puru, a name steeped in centuries of lineage. He knew the river intimately, its hidden shallows, treacherous currents, and the quiet inlets where the waters seemed to slumber. And he knew that Alexander would not attack, while the river raged in such fury. No one could. So he waited night after night, his soldiers taking turns watching the Macedonian campfires on the opposite shore. Porus scrutinized them, noting how the flames flickered and dimmed, how patrols shifted, how restless the foreign horses seemed. War was not just about brute strength. It was about understanding the mind of one's adversary. One evening, as the sky split open with streaks of lightning, Alexander summoned his generals. Inside a large tent, the scent of damp earth mingled with the aroma of oil lamps. Maps lay unfurled across a wooden table, the river's winding course traced in dark ink. Craterus, ever calm and reliable, stood beside the king. Cenas, sharp-eyed, leaned in to study the terrain. Hephaestion remained a step behind Alexander, silent but ever attentive. Alexander traced the map with his finger. Porus is watching our every move. He expects us to cross where the banks are widest. That is where he waits. But the river is long. He cannot defend every bend with equal strength. Cenas nodded. We must outweed him before we face his elephants. A faint smile touched Alexander's lips. Precisely. So, we divide the army? Hephaestion asked quietly. We divide, Alexander confirmed. Craterus will remain here, with enough force to convince Porus that this is our intended crossing point. I will take a select force northward, where the river curves behind the island. The monsoon will mask our movement. Porus will think the storm prevents action, but storms do not deter us. The generals exchanged glances. It was a daring plan, but audacity had always been Alexander's hallmark. As they prepared to leave, the rain intensified until it sounded like 1,000 drums pounding the earth. The sky turned almost black, swallowing the torchlight hole. But Alexander stepped out into the storm with the same ease with which he stepped onto a battlefield. His men followed, forming long lines that vanished into the night. The river roared even louder, as if angered that anyone dared challenge it. Hours later, as the night reached its deepest point, Alexander stopped near a cluster of trees where an island divided the river into 2 channels. The storm had eased into a mist, allowing shadows to regain their form. The island was thick with tall brush that rustled softly, concealing the Macedonians from Porus's scouts. Local fishermen had long used the spot as a natural crossing during commerce seasons. Alexander hoped that even in the monsoon, it would provide the narrow passage he needed. He looked toward the water, listening intently. The river sounded different here, less violent, more subdued, but danger still lurked beneath its surface. Currents could shift like living things, dragging entire units downstream. Alexander turned to his men, speaking with quiet resolve. The river is our first enemy. Cross it and we face the second. Remember that this night will decide not only our victory, but also our return home. They lowered their heads in solemn acknowledgement. The first unit stepped into the water, gripping ropes tied between boats. The river surged around their waists, then their chests. Horses whinnied, struggling to maintain their footing. Yet the Macedonians pressed onward. Torches were kept low, their flames shielded with silk cloth to avoid detection. The world narrowed to the sound of the river swallowing each footstep. Alexander crossed last. When he reached the opposite bank, soaked and breathless, he looked up to see faint stars blinking on the horizon. The storm had broken. The land before him stretched quiet and mysterious, waiting. Porus was still unaware, but the game had changed. This night was only the beginning. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the plains, turning the drifting mist into a soft, silvery blanket. The men who had crossed the river with Alexander tightened their gear, checked their horses, and steeled their minds for the coming day. Exhaustion clung to them like a second skin, yet beneath it lay the undeniable spark of anticipation. They had accomplished what many would have deemed impossible. Crossing the Hydaspes under the cover of darkness, evading the watchful eyes of Porus. The air was cool, but hints of humidity already pressed against their breaths. A faint smell of wet earth mingled with the scent of tall grass swaying in the morning breeze. Somewhere deeper in the plains, unfamiliar birds called out, their songs rising and falling like ripples over water. Everything felt different here, quiet, but with an underlying tension, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold. Alexander mounted Bucephalus, who snorted impatiently and pawed at the ground. The old stallion seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. "Easy, my friend," Alexander whispered, running his hand along the horse's thick mane. "We are not yet in battle." Hephaestion approached, his face still etched with the fatigue of the crossing. "Porus will learn of our landing soon," he said quietly. "His scouts must be close." "They will," Alexander replied. "But we move fast. Faster than they expected. Time is on our side for now." He turned to scan the horizon. A faint line of trees marked the direction where they suspected Porus's forward units might be positioned. Porus would never leave his main army entirely unguarded. He knew the terrain too well. If Alexander had crossed during the storm, then Porus would have a response prepared. The question was how soon it would arrive. Moments later, the answer began to materialize. A small dust cloud appeared on the distant edge of the plain, growing steadily, like breath fogging a mirror. Soon, dark shapes became visible, horsemen moving swiftly. Alexander narrowed his eyes. "Scouts," he said, "but more than just scouts. There are too many of them." The Macedonian troops shifted uneasily. They had crossed with only a portion of the army, leaving Craterus behind to maintain the illusion of inaction. If Porus sent a large enough force, the Macedonians could find themselves in real danger before reinforcements could arrive. Hephaestion raised a spear. "We should form a defensive line." "Not yet," Alexander said. "Let them come closer." and observe how they move. The approaching force revealed itself as the vanguard of Porus, a detachment of cavalry supported by chariots. The chariots were unlike anything the Macedonians had ever encountered. Their wheels were reinforced with long, curved blades that glinted menacingly even in the muted light. Cenas muttered, "Bladed chariots. They intend to break our ranks." "They will try," Alexander said calmly, "but they do not yet understand how our cavalry fights." The Indian horsemen slowed their advance, unsure whether Macedonians were ready to engage. For a moment, the two forces simply watched each other across the shimmering grass. The tension between them grew taut, like a bowstring stretched to its limit. Alexander stepped forward, raising his spear high. "Companions," he shouted, "to me!" His cavalry closed in around him with fluid precision, forming a wedge-shaped formation that had shattered countless enemy lines before. Dust billowed under the pounding hooves. The Indian chariots accelerated. The clash erupted in an explosion of sound. Hooves, wheels, shouts, metal grinding against metal. The bladed chariots cut through the tall grass, tearing the earth open, but the Macedonian cavalry didn't wait for impact. At the last possible moment, they split into two smaller wedges, sliding past the chariots and striking the flanks of the Indian horsemen. The maneuver was swift, practiced, deadly. Alexander led the left wing himself, thrusting his spear forward and unhorsing an Indian rider in a swift, practiced motion. He twisted his body, guided by instinct more than thought, and struck another before the man could regain his balance. The companions around him fought with fierce discipline, each movement part of the rhythmic dance of war. Across the plain, the Indian chariots attempted to turn, but the terrain betrayed them. The recent rains had softened the earth, causing wheels to sink and skid. Some chariots tipped as they struggled to pivot. Others slowed so dramatically that Macedonian light infantry rushed in to finish them off. Alexander saw the shift instantly. "Press them," he shouted. "Do not let them regroup." The companions surged forward, scattering the remaining cavalry. Within minutes, the vanguard of Porus was broken, retreating in disarray toward the tree line. Hephaestion rode up beside Alexander, blood staining his arm, though the wound was superficial. "They didn't expect us to be this far across the bank." "No," Alexander replied, "which means Porus will come himself. And with him, the elephants." The mere mention of elephants sent a tremor through the Macedonian ranks. The men had heard the stories. Towering beasts armored in iron, tusks sharpened to deadly points, driven forward by skilled mahouts. Even seasoned soldiers feared them, for elephants did not fight like men or horses. They were living walls of muscle and bone. Alexander sensed a wave of apprehension. He rode to the front, raising his voice so all could hear. "Porus brings elephants," he said, "but remember this. Every army has something that makes it proud. Ours is not size or beasts or blades on wheels. Ours is discipline. Ours is strategy. Ours is the courage to face what others flee." The men exhaled, the fear lessening slightly. By midday, the sky was fully cleared, though dark clouds lingered far to the south. The heat began to rise, blending with the heavy humidity of the land. The Macedonian soldiers rested briefly, tending to their wounds, tightening their armor, and drinking sparingly from their water skins. They knew that the calm would not last. Then at last they heard it, a deep, distant rumble, not thunder, not hooves, a sound that rolled across the plains with terrifying steadiness. Porus was coming. The elephants moved slowly, each step shaking the ground. Rows of Indian infantry surrounded them, their shields gleaming, their spears pointed like a field of bristling thorns. Cavalry flanked the formation, ready to counter any Macedonian maneuver. Alexander watched from a small rise, his expression unreadable. He had faced many armies. But this was different. It was a wall of living giants, blocking the path like a force of nature. Hephaestion whispered, "How do we break them?" Alexander smiled faintly, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "By remembering they are not gods," he said, "only creatures of flesh. And every creature bleeds." The wind shifted. The elephants continued their march. The real battle was about to begin. The night before the battle deepened into a restless silence. Alexander stood on a small rise overlooking the broad, dark ribbon of the Hydaspes River. The moonlight shimmered on its surface, giving the water a cold, metallic glow. The river seemed calm, almost serene. Yet every man in the Macedonian camp knew that crossing it would be the most dangerous gamble their king had ever undertaken. Alexander understood Porus well, a king who refused a bow, a warrior who stood proudly against the thunder of foreign armies. Porus would have prepared every possible defense along the riverbank, for he believed that Alexander, brilliant as he was, would attempt a direct crossing. A lesser commander might have charged head-on. Alexander, however, was no ordinary general. He had spent the entire evening riding quietly through the camp, observing the mood of his men, calculating every step of what would come at dawn. A gentle wind carried the distant rumble of thunder, a sign that a storm was brewing. And storms, Alexander mused, could conceal an army better than darkness alone. He gathered his generals under a solitary tree near the river's edge. The torchlight flickered across their faces. Craterus, calm and steady. Hephaestion, sharp-eyed. Perdiccas, stern and ready for action. And the young but fiercely loyal officers who had followed Alexander since his early days in Greece. "We crossed the river tonight," Alexander said quietly. The men stiffened. "Not here. Not where Porus expects us. We march upstream. His watchmen will see us come and go, but they won't know where we disappear. We will move like shadows, seen, yet never grasped." The plan was dangerous, requiring absolute precision, absolute silence, and absolute trust. But Alexander's army knew this rhythm of war too well. They had crossed deserts, climbed impossible mountains, and faced armies far larger than their own. The river was simply the next obstacle in their path. As the storm finally broke, with rain pouring like a curtain across the land, Alexander mounted his horse. Not Bucephalus. He was saving his great companion for the battle itself. Tonight, stealth was more important than majesty. The army moved slowly through the darkness, following Alexander along the riverbank, where the dense fog blurred the outlines of men and horses. Hours later, they reached a narrow bend in the river where a small island offered natural cover. Alexander raised his hand, signaling a halt. The sound of the river was louder here, rushing against the rocks. Under the cover of rain and thunder, the Macedonians began their crossing. The water was freezing. Soldiers gritted their teeth, clutching shields and spears as they waded through the current. Horses struggled, their hooves sinking into the riverbed, but the men pushed onward. Alexander crossed at the very front. Every step felt like walking through liquid stone, yet he moved with unshakable determination. When they reached the opposite shore, the sky was barely beginning to lighten. The storm had passed, leaving the land shrouded in a heavy mist. Through that mist came a sound, distant but unmistakable. The thud of hooves. And then shapes emerged, Porus's forward cavalry, sent to scout the river. Alexander's generals reached for their weapons, but Alexander raised a hand. "Steady," he whispered. "Let them come." The scouts advanced, unaware that they were riding directly into the hands of the Macedonian vanguard. When they finally realized what stood before them, it was too late. Alexander's cavalry surged forward with a sharp cry, and the two forces collided in a burst of chaos. The clash was quick, brutal, and overwhelming. The scouts scattered, some falling, others fleeing desperately back toward Porus's main camp. One rider, wounded and breathless, sped across the battlefield and burst into Porus's tent. "King Porus," he gasped. "Alexander, he has crossed a river." Porus rose slowly from his seat, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the tent. His eyes, dark and steady, showed no fear, only resolve. "Then the time has come," he said quietly. Outside, the elephants roared, sensing the impending conflict. Back on Alexander's side, the Macedonians formed their ranks on the grassy plain beyond the river. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the vastness of India's landscape. Flat, open ground stretching endlessly, framed by distant hills. Alexander rode along the line of his troops. Bucephalus returned to him and, restless beneath the saddle, snorted impatiently. Alexander lowered his hand to the horse's neck. "Easy," he murmured. Soon, his men watched him pass, some exhausted from the crossing, some nervous about the coming battle. Yet every one of them felt their courage rise when they saw him. Alexander's presence had always been the fire that kept them marching through the impossible. One soldier, young and trembling, met Alexander's gaze. Alexander stopped. "Your first battle against elephants?" he asked gently. The soldier nodded. Alexander smiled. "Then you will have a story to tell. Stay near your commander, follow his signal, and remember, no beast is stronger than the will of man who refuses to bow." The soldier's fear lessened, if only slightly. Behind Alexander, the full Macedonian army stretched like a living wall of bronze and iron. On the other side of the plain, Porus was forming his own line, elephants in front, infantry behind, and cavalry sweeping the flanks. The sight of the elephants alone was enough to shake the heart. Some were armored, their foreheads plated with iron. Others carried archers on their backs. Their trunks curled, their tusks gleamed, and their massive feet crushed the earth with slow, heavy thuds. A soft hush spread through the Macedonian ranks. Alexander lifted his spear toward the horizon, where the glow of dawn painted the sky gold. "This is the Hydaspes," he declared, "and today we carve our place into the memory of the world." The horn sounded. The battle had begun. The first sunlight broke through the last vestiges of mist as Alexander watched the distant formation of Porus's army settle into place. The elephants stood like living towers, their silhouettes looming over the infantry behind them. The ground trembled faintly with each step they took. Alexander faced countless enemies, Persian immortals, Scythian horsemen, Greek rebels, but never an adversary who commanded such gargantuan creatures carved from flesh and bone. He studied Porus's line with meticulous care. The elephants were arrayed in a long, imposing front, spaced evenly to afford each one its own patch of open ground. It was a clever formation, designed to break any cavalry charge long, before it could reach the infantry behind. Porus understood battlefield geometry, as well as any commander Alexander had ever faced. But Alexander did not succumb to fear. He felt a profound respect. He gently touched Bucephalus's neck. The horse tossed its head, snorting as if sensing the unnatural beast that awaited him ahead. Alexander whispered softly, "Easy, my friend. We've faced storms harsher than this." The trumpet blared and the Macedonian cavalry surged forward, not toward the center, but toward the wings. Dust billowed beneath the hooves of thousands of horses. Alexander's voice rang out across the battlefield. "Stretch their line. Make them choose their ground." His cavalry moved swiftly along the flanks, constantly shifting and probing, never fully committing. Each feint and maneuver was designed to provoke Porus, to force him to react and reveal his strategy. Porus responded with calm authority, sending his own cavalry to meet Alexander's movements, careful not to overextend his forces or give chase too eagerly. The Indian king possessed the demeanor of a mountain, unmoved, yet ever watchful. As the cavalry engaged in a deadly dance across the plains, Alexander signaled his infantry to advance. The Macedonian phalanx tightened its formation, their sarissas glinting like a forest of needles catching the sunlight. Their steps were steady, disciplined, unwavering. Porus's elephants began to lumber forward, advancing with slow but terrifying momentum. Archers perched atop their backs loosed volleys of arrows that whistled down upon the Macedonian shields. The elephants bellowed, swinging their trunks like whips and slamming them into the earth with thunderous force. As they drew nearer, Alexander felt the ground shaking more intensely beneath Bucephalus's hooves. Some Macedonian soldiers hesitated, some flinched, while others clenched their jaws and gripped their sarissas even tighter. The phalanx had withstood Persian chariots and walls of spears, but these creatures were different. They were fear given form. Alexander rode behind the line, calling out to his men to bolster their courage. "Hold! Let them come. They are mighty, but they bleed." The elephants struck first, crashing into front ranks, tossing men aside with their trunks, trampling shields and snapping sarissas in half. The Macedonian line buckled, groaned, and threatened to collapse. Screams echoed across the battlefield as men were flung into the air like rag dolls. But Alexander had anticipated this onslaught and prepared accordingly. Special anti-elephant units moved into action, agile troops armed with javelins and curved blades. They dodge around the massive beasts, aiming for the vulnerable spots behind their ears, their legs, and their eyes. The elephants roared in confusion and rage, turning their massive bodies in desperate circles. Porus watched from his chariot, a towering figure clad in gleaming armor. His booming voice carried commands across the field, guiding his elephants with astonishing precision. His chariot horses reared, sensing the chaos around them, but Porus stood steady, a pillar of iron amidst the storm. For a tense moment, the battle hung in precarious balance. The Macedonian cavalry finally broke through the opposing riders on the flank, pushing them back toward the center. Alexander's eyes widened. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He raised his arm high, signaling the final maneuver. Bucephalus surged forward and Alexander charged, his companion cavalry following like a wave crashing against stone. They rode straight for the gap that was forming between Porus's cavalry and infantry. Porus's elephants, now embroiled in the phalanx, could not turn in time to intercept the assault. Alexander's wedge formation sliced forward, and dust and screams filled the air as horsemen clashed, their swords flashing in jagged streaks of silver. The momentum of the companion cavalry carried them deep into Porus's ranks, scattering archers and unnerving even the bravest warriors. Porus saw the breach and shouted for his own cavalry to pivot, but Alexander had anticipated this move as well. His hidden reserves, stationed farther upstream after the river crossing, now stormed onto the battlefield from the side, striking like a hammer and catching Porus's cavalry off guard. The Indian line began to waver. Elephants, panicked and wounded, turned back into their own ranks, rampaging blindly and trampling friendly soldiers. Others fell to the ground with shuddering groans. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. A maelstrom of shouts, smoke, dust, steel, and a deep thunder collapsing giants. Through the haze, Alexander spotted him, Porus, still standing tall on his chariot. The massive war elephant, still a commanding presence, remained unbroken amidst the chaos. Even as confusion and death swirled around him, he radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable dignity. Alexander felt a profound emotion stir within him. Not the thrill of triumph, but genuine admiration. He whispered, almost inaudibly, a worthy opponent, indeed. Bucephalus surged forward, carrying Alexander directly into the weakening heart of the Indian line. Macedonian banners followed in a powerful wave, sweeping aside the last vestiges of resistance. The sun climbed higher, burning away the lingering mist and revealing the battlefield's utter devastation. The outcome was undeniable. Porus was surrounded. Yet, he refused to kneel, not yet willing to concede. The battle was drawing to a close, but the saga of Porus and Alexander was far from its final chapter. The battlefield finally fell silent. The cries of men and the thunderous roar of elephants faded into the distance, replaced by the gentle rustling of the wind across the plains of the Hydaspes. Dust hung in the air like a pale, ethereal mist, slowly settling over the fallen warriors, Macedonian and Indian alike. As Alexander rode forward, Bucephalus stepped with deliberate care, as if understanding the gravity of the events that had transpired. The soldiers respectfully parted to allow their king passage. Some lowered their heads in somber acknowledgement, while others leaned heavily on broken spears, their faces etched with deep exhaustion. Victory had been achieved, but its cost was starkly evident in the silent rows of the dead. Alexander's gaze remained fixed ahead. Porus still lived. Word had reached him that the Indian king, gravely wounded but unbowed, had been captured after his elephant, finally succumbing to exhaustion and grievous injuries, collapsed beneath him. Even in defeat, Porus had refused to flee or surrender. He had fought to the bitter end, standing tall above the carnage like a living embodiment of unwavering resolve. Alexander dismounted. The air was warm, carrying the mingled scents of trampled grass and the promise of distant rain. Soldiers escorted Porus toward him. The Indian king walked with evident difficulty, bloodied, his armor battered and dented, a spear wound marring his side. Yet his posture remained erect, his stride resolute. His sheer height made him appear a titan among ordinary men. There was no fear in Porus's eyes, only unwavering dignity. He was brought before Alexander, who studied him with quiet admiration. Here stood a king who had faced overwhelming odds without yielding, a man who commanded elephants as if they were extensions of his own will, a ruler who had defended his empire's frontier with a courage few could equal. Alexander spoke first, his tone gentle. "Porus," he said, "you fought bravely. Few have ever tested my mettle as you have." The Indian king's voice, though strained, remained deep and steady. "I fought as a king should." Silence hung between them. A silence not of hostility, but of respect forged in the crucible of battle. Alexander stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Porus could hear. "Tell me," he said, "how would you wish to be treated?" Porus raised his head, his eyes unwavering. His answer came without the slightest hesitation. "As a king." Those 3 words echoed across the plain, not as a supplication, but as a declaration, a final assertion of his identity. Battered, bleeding, surrounded, yet still every inch a king. Alexander felt something shift within him, like the earth trembling before a storm. Admiration deepened into something greater, a recognition of a shared indomitable spirit. He smiled. "And as a king you shall be treated." The soldiers around him exchanged surprised glances. Alexander rarely extended such honor to a defeated enemy, but Porus was no ordinary foe. He had stood his ground against the greatest military mind of the age and had not faltered. He deserved more than mere chains. Alexander approached, placing a hand lightly on Porus's arm, not as conqueror to captive, but as king to king. "Your lands are restored to you," Alexander said, "and more land besides, as far as you can govern." Porus's eyes softened, although his expression remained proud. For the first time since the battle had begun, he allowed himself a breath that did not taste of war. "Then I will serve you with loyalty," he said, "not as a slave, but as an equal ally." Alexander nodded slowly. "That is all I ever ask." In that moment, the bloodshed of the battlefield seemed to recede into the background. 2 warriors, weary yet unbroken, stood not as adversaries but on equal footing. The Hydaspes had given birth to something rare. Respect born in fire, a bond stronger than conquest itself. As the sun climbed higher, Porus was escorted, with honor this time, to receive medical care. Alexander watched him go, reflecting on the strange duality of battle, how it both destroyed and united, how it tested the limits of men, but also revealed the depth of their character. He turned to Bucephalus and stroked the stallion's mane. The horse snorted softly, tired but alive. Alexander whispered, "We will not forget what happened here." Later that day, as the Macedonian camp buzzed with activity, repairing damage and tending to wounded, Alexander withdrew to a quiet hill overlooking the river. The Hydaspes shimmered serenely beneath the late afternoon light. Its waters had carried the armies into conflict, and now they continued their eternal song, indifferent to the triumphs and tragedies of mortal men. Alexander closed his eyes. He saw Porus standing tall atop his war elephant, a formidable figure of defiance. He saw the devastating charge that had nearly broken his phalanx. He saw his own cavalry cutting through the chaos like a spear of light. He heard the echo of Porus's defiant words. As a king, the battle had secured his victory in India, but more importantly, it had taught him a rare lesson, the value of an equal. Perhaps conquest was not always the ultimate glory. Perhaps understanding one's opponent, respecting his strength, acknowledging his spirit. These were victories that would outlast empires. When Alexander returned to camp, he issued one final order for the day. The dead of both sides were to be honored. Pyres were to be built with care. Names were to be recorded whenever possible. No distinction was to be made between Macedonian and Indian fallen. They had all fought bravely. Night descended slowly, shrouding the battlefield in darkness. The fires flickered, carrying offerings of smoke toward the starlit sky. Soldiers gathered in small groups, quietly sharing food and recounting tales of fallen friends, of the strange nobility of King Porus, and of the courage displayed on both sides of the conflict. Alexander watched the flames from a distance. The Hydaspes would be remembered as one of his greatest victories, but he knew that history would ultimately recall something far more profound, that in this battle, 2 kings had met, clashed in fierce combat, and ultimately emerged with their mutual respect intact. It was a rare war that concluded with dignity preserved on both sides. The next morning, Alexander and Porus met again, no longer as enemies, but as rulers tasked with shaping the future of the lands they would now share.